You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 2, Burglary, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 5. Dock Day. Kuro spent every spare minute he had over the last few days before school trying to make another ring hover, to no avail. Cyclones he could make, carefully controlled ones not so much. He suspected somewhat that Oganov had helped him. He clearly wanted Kuro to pass, as a matter of both kindness and pride. He wouldn't like to think his teaching would produce a student as poor as Kuro. That theory was shattered, however, when Kuro received his grades. He'd done well, but that wasn't the point. What became clear was that he hadn't needed to float the ring to pass. He'd earned enough marks even without that. Sorting that out could wait, for the moment at least. There was another mystery that needed clearing up, and he would finally have direct access to the people involved. He spent the bus ride to the ferry that would carry them to Avalon Academy, carefully crafting questions for Charlie and Arthur about their lack of letters. He'd sent dozens to each of them, to Miss Crawley, and even a couple of his classmates, Oliver and Magna, and hadn't received a single letter in return. He hadn't received a single thing at all. The bus passed through a carefully manicured tunnel of trees into the ferry dock parking lot. It was already busy with other students and littered with cars, carriages, and carpets from all over the Three Kingdoms. Parents tried to give their tear-filled farewells or stern lectures about the value of scholarship, while their children desperately tried to escape to find their friends. The orphans had no such ritual to perform. Miss Bridget was too busy making certain the two new students had everything they needed to worry about the older ones. They piled off their bus and quickly added a measure of chaos to the proceedings at the docks. While only a dozen strong, they lacked the shackles of propriety that the presence of parents placed on the other children. They crashed over the parking lot in a wave of hugs, greetings, and insults. Their impact rolled through the crowd, pulling students along with it, away from their families and towards the boat. The princess sat at the dock waiting. It was a hulking brute of a ship, and had clearly been in service for ages. The powerful steel prow was scarred from breaking up ice that filled the bay in the winter months. The gangplank squeaked and rattled like it was one footfall away from collapse, as porters carried student bags on board. The only attempt at matching the ship's name was the bright white paint with blue and gold embellishments, but even that was laid on in too many layers and with too little care. Kuro knew all of that was a lie. He had seen his former master turn the entire hull to sugar and leave it sweetening the harbor. This princess was indistinguishable from the previous. Someone had gone to great effort to create a perfect replica of the original. Kuro doubted if that one had even been the original. This boat was ugly on purpose. Kuro surmised that it was to avoid standing out on the trip through the Blandlands to Avalon Island. It was carefully calculated to be just presentable enough for the wealthy parents to allow their children onto it, while not so ostentatious as to draw attention to it out in the bay. Another bus pulled into the parking lot alongside the one from the orphanage. Its passengers disembarked with less vigor than the orphans. They dismounted hesitantly, staring with confusion, wonder, and fear at the assembly of people on the docks. These children were dressed strangely, wearing cotton t-shirts, jeans, hoodies, and nylon jackets. They were the Fireflies, children from outside the Vale who had spent their summer in the magic-free Blandlands and were now returning to the Fey Realm. As Kuro approached them, he saw a pair of familiar faces dismounting together. Marie and Sean stood out in the crowd and were both trying not to. Sean was the palest person Kuro had ever met, with carrot-orange hair that stuck out at odd angles, much like his teeth. He hunched his shoulders and ducked his head in a hopeless attempt to hide behind the other students. Marie was his complete opposite. Dark, with tightly ordered braids and a stiff, proud posture she was clearly copying from the nearby Tirnanogian students. They looked more like tourists failing to look like locals than returning students. When Kuro went up to greet them, he was met with confusion. Sean introduced himself as though they'd never met, and Marie returned his greeting but lacked her usual spirit. "Hey, how are you, Kuro?" Her words were distant and uncertain, like she only half recognized him, and she had to probe the corners of her mind to recall his name. Before he could ask anything about it, he was ushered away by an adult minder of the Fireflies. "Don't bother the Blandlanders," he said sternly. "They haven't had their memories returned yet, and you'll just confuse them. Give us a few minutes and we'll have her back to normal." Kuro was given a little shove to encourage him farther away. He didn't fight it. Marie wouldn't thank him if he delayed the process. Also, despite looking like an aging shopkeeper, the minder moved like a guardsman. All the adults on the Firefly bus did. They marched more than walked. Their postures were strong, and they kept looking around, focusing on nothing but seeing everything, as if they were patrolling the market. It wasn't clear if they were in disguise to seem more friendly to the Fireflies, or to avoid distressing the ordinary students and their families. A half-dozen guards in uniform have a way of chilling the air. Kuro watched as most of the Fireflies were led into a small building at the side of the parking lot that he'd never noticed before. It could be mistaken for a large tool shed, a simple square building with a single metal door. It was made of heavy stone, however, and the door had multiple locks. Once the guard had it open, one Firefly at a time was let in, looking vacant and confused, and exited a few minutes later, rattled but recognizing the scene around them. Two other Fireflies, the youngest, were led directly to the ferry. Each had a personal minder to make sure they got on the boat and didn't get off. They were the new students. Like Marie, they had found their way through the veil by accident at some point in their lives and were gifted enough in magic to be brought back later for proper schooling. They would both be first years at Autumn Lodge. Kuro scanned the crowd as he waited for Marie to be finished. He picked out his nemesis, Evelyn Lemieux, being fawned over by a collection of students. She looked like a painting. Like all the imperfections of a real human had been smoothed away by an expert artist's hand. Every blonde curl lay perfectly without a single hair wandering astray. Even though she wore the same school uniform as everyone else, hers was immaculate. The white shirt and cardigan were perfectly tailored, the pleated kilt perfectly crisp, as if it had been designed for her and everyone else was just wearing cheap copies. Evelyn was rich, smart, beautiful, and had very nearly enough royal blood to be a princess. Those were all her good qualities. Everything else about her was rot and malice. She saw others as existing only to celebrate her perfection or serve her. Kuro wondered whether Azalea would be upset to know that Kuro disliked Evelyn more than her. He also considered that, despite his best efforts, he was collecting enemies. Not a good practice. Marie thumped Kuro on the shoulder to get his attention. "Nice haircut," she said in her rough Montreal accent. "How was your summer?" "Boring," replied Kuro. "Except for a duel in Bytown, I was trapped in an orphanage with not much to do. How about you?" "It was weird. I could remember school, but not very well. I missed you guys, but I didn't remember why." She adjusted a pair of thick-rimmed glasses as she spoke. "And my parents didn't really notice. They got a report card from the school that made it look like I did really well in normal subjects and didn't ask much else. My brothers and sisters, they asked questions, but mostly they wanted to tell me about their year. The strangest part of the whole thing is that I didn't notice either. The big holes in my memory did not bother me. My brain just filled them in with something believable." "Oh, what about your friends?" asked Kuro. "Blandlands ones. Didn't they notice?" Marie chewed on her lip a little before replying, "Not really, no. Have you found Charlie and Arthur yet?" She changed the subject sharply, making it clear that she was quite finished with discussing her Blandlands life. "Not yet," said Kuro, "but I think I saw the truck Charlie's dad drives." It hadn't been hard to find in the crowd. In a lot full of elk-drawn sledges, unicorn-drawn carriages, and magic carpets, a rusting red pickup truck stood out. Charlie wasn't much harder to find. Her voice carried through the din of chatting students and rumbling luggage. Wild gesticulations made her easy to spot among the crowd. She was speaking to a small collection of amused onlookers, whom Kuro recognized. As a stray and a farmer, Charlie's father stood out in the crowd as much as his truck. He was broad and sturdy, built up from a lifetime of labor without the aid of magic, and wore as much dirt as he did denim. Arthur's mother was also there, a mirror opposite of the farmer beside her. She was half his size, and yet her presence dwarfed him. She dressed in a stiff, impeccably tailored gray wool suit. which looked more like armor than clothing, and probably was. She was a Knight of the Sun, a true noble lady, and a warrior sworn to defend the kingdom of Tirnanog. Even while smiling and laughing along with Charlie's stories, she maintained an imposing posture, a challenge and a warning to anyone who might approach. Kuro noted her left hand habitually moving to rest on the hilt of a sword, but since she had not come armed to drop off her children for school, the hand just fell to her hip. Beside her was Arthur's sister. She was tiny, barely taller than Kuro. Yet she seemed entirely unaware of the fact and stood as though she were towering over everyone around her. She was like an unpolished miniature copy of her mother. She had the same auburn hair and light eyes, wore a similar gray coat over her new school uniform, and struck the same pose while carrying none of the grandeur. She was like a kitten beside a tiger. Absent from the gathering was Arthur's father. Kuro was grateful, as he'd no interest in meeting Dubois again so soon. Also, there was a second Charlie. Two girls with entirely the same features stood side by side. Both had the same haystack of untamed hair, the same bright eyes, and the same deep tan from a life spent outdoors. They even had matching pimples. They wore the same school uniform clothes of dark gray slacks and sweater vests over a white button-down. Despite looking identical, however, they could not be mistaken for one another. One was talking loudly while grinning like an unzipped backpack. Her hands were telling a story as much as her mouth, and her arms seemed to have to rush to keep up with the rapid motions. The other Charlie was standing quite still and attending to the pavement just in front of her toes. As Kuro and Marie approached, the Charlies caught sight of them and both turned to greet them. "Hi, Charlie," Kuro said to the storyteller. "Hi, Arthur," he added to the quieter girl. "How could you tell which one was which?" demanded the more vocal of the pair, apparently expecting the duplicate standing next to her to confuse her friends. Kuro stuttered to respond, but Marie stepped in to rescue him. "We are your roommates, aren't we? Would you not be more bothered if we could not tell the difference?" "But we look identical!" Charlie insisted, pointing between her and Arthur, though it was rapidly becoming less true. His features were drifting, his jaw squared. His hair faded from Charlie's wheat field yellow to a milder, mousy blonde and fell into a neat part. His eyes drifted to a paler blue, and his lean, lanky limbs softened and plumped slightly. Arthur didn't look all that different from Charlie in his normal state. He was a milder, less vibrant version of her. It wasn't what Arthur really looked like, though. As a changeling, he didn't really look like anything. His familiar appearance was more a matter of habit than anything. "I told you they'd be able to guess," he said flatly. His contribution to the conversation fell on deaf ears, as Charlie had already forgotten her upset at being so easily identified. "Why didn't you answer my letters?" she abruptly demanded of Kuro. Kuro, who'd prepared himself for a lengthy and clever interrogation of his friends and their writing habits, hadn't considered that he might be the one being questioned. "I didn't get any letters. Did you get mine?" "You didn't send any letters to me," she replied as though it were an undeniable fact. "I did, though," Kuro found himself pleading. "I sent lots to both you and Arthur." Arthur added his small contribution. "I didn't get any letters. Did you have the address wrong?" "Maybe," said Kuro, starting to feel less certain of himself. He had copied their addresses from notes that Arthur and Charlie had written themselves. He couldn't imagine that they were both wrong, or that he'd made a mistake every time he copied them. None of it made any sense, but Charlie refused to give him time to investigate further. She was distracted by a much more urgent and pressing matter. "Hey, Marie! You got glasses!" Marie removed the pair of blocky, thick-rimmed lenses and sneered at them in disgust. "Yeah," she said, "I ate them." Her loathing was washed away by an epiphany as her brain detangled some of the memories that had just been returned. "Is there someone at the school who can fix my eyes with magic? Can the school nurse do that?" There was an uncomfortable silence as nobody was immediately ready to crush her hopes. The silence drained her optimism and quickly replaced it with anger. Kuro swallowed his fear first. It wasn't an act of bravery. He was just better practiced at cowardice than the others, and he could sense a fast-burning fuse and didn't want Marie to get upset. "Magic can't do that. he said as apologetically as he could. Half the teachers wear glasses. A wave of disappointment threatened to crush Marie, but Arthur's mother steadied her with a comforting hand on her shoulder. Doing magic like that on a person is much more likely to pop out their eyes than to fix anything. I'm very sorry, dear. She spoke gently, with kindness, and her noble bearing and polished Tirnanogian accent made it feel as though she were apologizing on behalf of all wizard kind. I think they make you look smart, encouraged Charlie. Marie returned them to her face so she could glare at Charlie through them. I don't need to look smart, she snarled. What is magic even good for? Arthur's mother tried to comfort Marie. Well, we could use magic to change their shape or color to something you prefer. She said it with a smile and a tilt of her head, making it sound like an opportunity and an adventure. Marie removed her glasses again so she could face the offending objects. She'd wrestled with the suggestion for a few moments, and then, seeming to have made some tenuous peace with her glasses, she started to change their color. They fluttered through a few shades of red and blue before settling on a dark purple. She returned them to her face. Well now, how did you do that? Arthur's mother brought her hands to her mouth in astonished delight. It is nothing special, said Marie. It is just a thing that I learned to do on my own. It's not like Arthur and his shape-changing, or Charlie and her moving things with her mind. I rather disagree. If I could do that, I could reduce my wardrobe by 2/3, and none would be the wiser. Arthur's mother tapped her lower lip and thought for a moment before adding, I do wonder if I could kidnap you for a day or two. My office is painfully drab, and I could use your remarkable talents. Her gentleness and good humor seemed, at first, at odds with her knightly role and imposing presence. As she spoke, though, Kuro realized that it was quite the opposite. She was so confident in her power that she had the luxury of kindness. Her encouragement seemed to ease Marie's frustrations. A hint of a smile even crept into her face, though she fought it ferociously. The brief stillness in conversation was interrupted by an exclamation from Arthur. Ow, he said, though it was more of a statement than a cry of pain. Oh, right, sorry, he continued in the same inexpressive voice. This is my sister. He gestured to a young girl standing beside him who had just punched him as a means of eliciting an introduction. She thrust out a hand in greeting. Lady Moira O'Mearis, daughter of Dame Aine O'Mearis, defender of the Sun Throne. So pleased to make your acquaintance. Arthur has told us so much about you. I must rely on your generous kindness as my seniors as I begin my first year at Avalon. It sounded rehearsed. She repeated the greeting with Marie, but in perfect French. The fairy whistle blew, signaling imminent departure. Arthur's mother quietly said her small farewells to her 2 children with the propriety and reserve expected of a Tirnanogian lady. Charlie and her father, feeling no such obligations for maintaining appearances, exchanged a vocal and tearful parting as they embraced and promised to write and worried over the animals at the farm who had missed Charlie's presence. They were so overcome with emotion that Marie and Kuro had to separate them to keep Charlie from missing the boat. The 4 friends climbed to the top deck of the ferry to their favorite seats, with Moira following close behind. It was where Kuro had first met Marie and Charlie, and despite the cold and damp passage across the bay, they returned to the benches out of an odd sense of loyalty, and a confidence that nobody else would want those seats. They were disappointed to find that the seats were not empty. The benches of the upper deck were occupied by a group of wary and distrustful individuals, much like the year prior. There was a brown-haired girl with a braid so long and thick she probably had to strain her neck to keep her head upright. A tall, dark-skinned boy struggling to hide tears, and a black-haired girl with her nose buried in a book. Kuro turned to leave, or rather to retreat, but Marie and Charlie pressed on. You must be the new Fireflies! Charlie exclaimed and bounced up to the girl with the braid. I bet you have questions! Marie approached the boy on the opposite bench more delicately and said, I'm from Montreal. How about you? Will you be staying on Autumn Lodge with us? The 2 children seemed grateful to have guides offering comfort and advice. The third one, the one with the book, ignored the goings-on and just pulled the book closer to her face. Her behavior didn't surprise Kuro in the least. In a way, he should have expected to find Azalea out here. It was quiet and isolated. If Bella was with friends, then Azalea was with books. That was the way of things. Should we go and talk with that other girl? Asked Arthur, feeling the obligation to follow his friend's lead but lacking the skill or conviction to do so. "No," answered Kuro. "I know her. She's not a Blandlander or a Larger. She's a first-year Summerhiller." "She's like me, then!" exclaimed Arthur's sister. She pushed past Arthur and Kuro as if they were a pair of swinging doors and marched up to Azalea. She gave a polite curtsy, then put out her hand to the reading girl. "Lady Moira O'Murius, daughter of Dame Aino O'Murius, at your service. I'm certain we'll be great friends." As Azalea let down her book and returned the greeting, Kuro had the feeling he had just witnessed the beginning of something terrible. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.